Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be taking you on a journey through biblical history, but not the kind you might expect. We're going beyond, the familiar stories, and we're going to be exploring something called dispensations.
Ooh, dispensations.
Yeah,
That sounds interesting.
yeah. Think of them like distinct chapters, each with its own rules and dynamics, and how God interacts with humanity. Our source material is actually, it's a sermon
Okay.
that was delivered to a church congregation, and it lays out this fascinating framework
Mm-hmm.
of 7 dispensations, spanning from Genesis
Yeah.
all the way to Revelation.
Yeah.
And I am so excited to unpack all of this with you.
Oh, I am too. You're in for a treat, I think, because this
Okay.
this deep dive reveals these transitions aren't just abstract theological concepts. They're filled with surprising details and very human moments that really bring the Bible to life.
Yeah, I was hooked from the start. I was like, wait a minute, what is this? Okay, so we've got 7 of these dispensations to cover, so where do we even begin?
Well, I think a good place to start is by understanding what a dispensation actually is. Essentially, it's a specific period in biblical history where God interacts with humanity in a unique way. It's almost like setting different ground rules for each era.
Okay.
And it all begins with the dispensation of innocence. Think Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden.
Ah, the original paradise. They had a direct line to God, this beautiful garden to enjoy. Like, what could possibly go wrong?
That's the question, isn't it? Their responsibility was very simple. Obedience.
Obedience, right?
But as we know, they ate from that forbidden tree of knowledge, and that changed everything. It wasn't just about breaking a rule, it was a fundamental shift in the human experience.
Mm,
This is where we see sin and death enter the world.
innocence lost. But the sermon points out that even in this act of judgment, God still extends grace. He doesn't just abandon Adam and Eve, but he gives them this promise of a redeemer, someone to set things right. It's that glimmer of hope that kind of sets the stage for everything else, right?
Exactly, yeah. And that brings us to the dispensation of conscience. Now we move beyond the Garden of Eden, and we see Cain and Abel and their descendants. And here, the focus shifts from simple obedience to a more nuanced understanding of right and wrong. So now humans have a conscience, an inner sense of morality.
But knowing the story, I'm guessing that conscience alone wasn't enough to keep things on track.
Sadly, no. This period is marked by just escalating wickedness, and it ultimately culminates in the flood. It raises some pretty big questions, like, was this moral decay inevitable? Did free will doom this era from the start?
So much to think about already. And amidst all this chaos, we see that familiar pattern emerge again. God's judgment, but also his grace. He sends the flood, but he saves Noah and his family and gives humanity another chance.
It's true. That cycle of judgment and grace is definitely a recurring theme throughout all these dispensations, and it makes me wonder, is it a reflection of God's unchanging nature? Or is it a response to the specific choices that humanity keeps making over and over? It's fascinating. Okay, I am ready for the next chapter. What happens after the flood? Okay, so after the flood, things get really interesting with the dispensation of human government.
Oh, human government.
Well, I know, right?
Here we go.
So here, God establishes a covenant with Noah. It's symbolized by the rainbow. And it's this promise that there will be no more world-destroying floods. But it's also where God grants humanity the authority to govern itself.
Okay, so it's like God saying, all right, you guys want to run things, go for it.
Uh,
I can't imagine that went perfectly according to plan, though.
You would think, right? Well, it didn't. The first major act of this self-governance was building the Tower of Babel.
Of course, yeah.
This massive structure meant to reach heaven. Instead of dispersing and populating the earth, as God had instructed, humanity united in defiance.
They said, no, we're going to do our own thing.
Yeah.
It sounded like a classic case of human pride, overstepping boundaries, thinking that they could somehow become gods themselves. Like, how many times do we see that throughout history, even today?
It really makes you think. The Tower of Babel might be an ancient story, but aren't we still trying to reach heaven on our own terms today? Think about our constant striving for progress, our obsession with building bigger and better, our desire for recognition and power. It's fascinating to consider how these ancient narratives still reflect our modern-day struggles.
That's a great point. Okay, but before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's get back to the story. What was the fallout from this whole Tower of Babel incident?
Well, God, he intervened by confusing their languages, scattering them across the globe, and it was both a judgment for their defiance, but it was also kind of a redirection.
Yep.
That scattering of people led to the diversity of cultures and languages that we see today.
Oh, wow. That's mind-blowing when you think about it. But even amidst the chaos, there's that familiar glimmer of grace again.
Always, yes. It's in this context that God chooses Abraham, and he initiates the lineage that will lead to the Jewish people. It's a pivotal moment, setting the stage for a new covenant and a new direction for humanity.
It seems like there's this pattern emerging here, right? God gives humanity a chance. We mess up. God redirects, and a new chapter begins. It's like it almost feels like an ongoing conversation.
I like that, yeah. A conversation with its share of misunderstandings and course corrections, but a conversation nonetheless. And that brings us to the next major transition, the dispensation of promise.
Okay. The dispensation of promise.
This period centers around the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob,
Yep.
and the promises that God makes to them. It's all about establishing a chosen people destined to inherit a specific land and ultimately to bless all the families of the earth.
It's like this whole family saga going on here. Generations bound together by these divine promises. But I can already sense a but coming. Humans rarely follow the script perfectly.
Oh, you know it. The responsibility during this period was for Abraham and his descendants to dwell in the land of Canaan, a land that God promised to them. But instead, they end up in Egypt, which leads to generations of bondage.
Another detour, another consequence. But even then, the sermon makes it clear that God doesn't abandon his people. He sends Moses, the deliverer, to lead them out of Egypt and towards the promised land.
Precisely. And it's such a powerful reminder that even when humans stray, God is always working, to guide them back. And this sets the stage for a monumental shift, the transition to the dispensation of law where things get a lot more structured.
Ah, I'm sensing a rulebook is coming into play. Tell me more about this dispensation of law.
So this period is defined by Moses receiving the law on Mount Sinai, most notably the Ten Commandments. It's a clear set of guidelines for how to live and how to worship. And it's a stark departure from that more intuitive guidance, from the conscience in the previous dispensation.
So it's like God saying, okay, let's try this again, but this time with some clear-cut instructions.
Yeah.
But knowing human nature, I'm guessing even this detailed rulebook couldn't guarantee smooth sailing.
You're right. The sermon makes it clear that the Israelites, they really tried, but they were unable to perfectly uphold the law. And, it really underscores a fundamental truth about human nature, that we are inherently flawed. We're prone to stumble, even when we have the best intentions.
It really makes you wonder, was the law ever meant to be perfectly kept? Or was it, as the sermon suggests, a way to reveal our need for something more, something beyond our ability to achieve, even through rule following?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's a question that theologians have debated for centuries. But one thing that's clear is that this dispensation of law played a crucial role in God's plan. It set the stage for the coming of Jesus and a radical shift in how humanity could connect with the divine.
That brings us to the dispensation of grace, a period that, according to this framework, began with a dramatic conversion experience on the road to Damascus. Can you tell us more about this shift and what makes it so significant?
Absolutely. This is where things get really interesting, especially for us, because the dispensation of grace marks the emergence of the church and a central message of salvation through grace, not by works. It's a radical departure from that previous dispensation's focus on the law. Instead, it emphasizes God's unconditional love and forgiveness through Jesus Christ.
So we're back with our deep dive into biblical transitions. We're currently exploring the dispensation of grace, which, as we've learned, ushered in a radically new way for humanity to connect with God. It's not about striving to follow laws, but about accepting God's grace.
And this dispensation of grace is particularly relevant to us.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's the one we're living in now. It's the chapter of the story that we are actively participating in.
That makes it all the more important to understand, right? So how does this idea of salvation through grace actually play out in practice? What are our responsibilities in this dispensation?
Well, the sermon emphasizes the role of the church, the community of believers, as stewards of this grace. So it's our responsibility to spread the gospel, the good news of God's love and forgiveness, and also to embody its principles in how we live our lives. It's definitely a challenging message, but it's also very hopeful. It's calling us to live in a way that reflects the grace that we've received.
It's a beautiful idea. But I'm curious, how does this idea of grace coexist with the reality of, human imperfection? I mean, even within the church, we see people struggling, making mistakes, falling short. Does that mean we're failing at this dispensation of grace?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of what it means to live in this era. The sermon acknowledges that, yes, while we're saved by grace, that doesn't magically erase our human nature.
Right.
We're still going to struggle. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to fall short. That's just part of our journey.
So it's not about achieving perfection, but acknowledging our need for grace and extending that grace to others, even when they mess up.
Exactly. It's a constant process of learning, growing, and relying on God's grace to pick us up when we fall. And what's really intriguing is that according to this framework, the dispensation of grace isn't the final chapter.
Okay.
There's one more transition, one final era, and it takes us into the realm of prophecy and revelation. We're talking about the dispensation of the millennium.
Okay, things are about to get really interesting. I've heard about the millennium, but to be honest, it's always seemed a bit mysterious to me. Can you shed some light on what this final dispensation entails?
Yeah, the sermon describes the millennium as a 1,000-year period that follows the second coming of Jesus Christ.
Okay.
It's a time when Christ will reign on earth. And according to the sermon, the Old Testament saints, they'll rule alongside him. It's also a period where Satan is bound, which means that evil's influence is going to be significantly diminished.
Wow, it sounds like a truly utopian era, like a divine reset button for the world. But even in this seemingly perfect scenario, the sermon mentions a final rebellion. It seems like no matter how good things get, humanity just has a knack for messing things up.
It's a very sobering thought, isn't it? And the sermon doesn't go into detail about the specifics of this rebellion, but it does raise some pretty profound questions about the nature of free will. Even in a world that's been transformed by Christ's presence, humans, we still have the capacity to choose, and sadly, some will choose to reject God's authority.
It's a reminder that transformation isn't automatic or forced upon us. It's a choice that we have to make, even in the face of overwhelming grace and goodness. But what happens after this final rebellion? Does the world just simply end?
No, the story doesn't end there. This is where we get into the truly awe-inspiring and some might say mind-boggling aspects of biblical prophecy. Because the millennium isn't the final chapter. It's followed by something even more transformative, the destruction of the old earth and the creation of a new heaven and a new earth.
Whoa, talk about a cosmic makeover. It makes me wonder what happens to humanity during this transition. Where do we go from here?
This is where things get really interesting, and this is also where interpretations can differ. The sermon specifically highlights two distinct destinies. One for the church, the body of Christ,
Oh.
and another for those under the old covenant.
Okay, so we're talking about a cosmic sorting hat moment. Who goes where and why? I'm on the edge of my seat here.
I understand. It's a lot to take in. So the sermon suggests that the church, those who have accepted salvation through grace in the current dispensation, they'll reside eternally in heaven with Jesus. It's a picture of ultimate communion and fellowship with God, a state of perfect peace and joy that transcends our earthly understanding.
That sounds absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering about those who live before Christ, or those who haven't heard the message of grace. What's their fate in this new creation?
Well, the sermon suggests that the faithful from the Old Testament, those who lived according to God's covenant before Jesus came, they will inherit the new earth. And they'll finally experience the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. They'll dwell in a restored paradise, free from the curse of sin and death.
So two distinct destinies, but both filled with hope and the promise of a future that's free from suffering and pain. It's mind-boggling to even think about.
It really is. And as we delve into these final chapters, these ultimate transitions, it's important to remember that the sermon is offering one interpretation of these complex concepts. There's a very rich history of theological debate and discussion surrounding these ideas. And, different denominations and scholars, they may hold varying perspectives.
It's a good reminder. We're exploring one particular framework, but ultimately it's up to each individual to wrestle with these ideas and come to their own understanding.
Exactly. It's not about blindly accepting one interpretation, but about engaging with these concepts thoughtfully and seeking truth in a way that resonates with our own faith journeys.
Well said. As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what is the key takeaway that you would like to leave listeners with as they ponder these very profound ideas?
I think the most important message is this. The Bible isn't just a static text, it's a dynamic story of God's ongoing interaction with humanity. And these transitions, these moments of shift and change, they reveal a God who is both consistent in his love, but also flexible in his approach.
It reminds us that no matter what chapter we find ourselves in, God is constantly working, adapting, and offering new pathways to connect with him.
And even though the final dispensation points toward an end to the story as we know it, it's not an ending filled with despair or fear. It's a new beginning. It's a promise of ultimate restoration and a world made new.
That is a powerful and very hopeful message. As we move into the final part of our deep dive, we're going to explore this idea of a new creation and what it might mean for us, both individually and as part of the larger story of humanity. Stay with us. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been on quite a journey, haven't we, through biblical history, exploring these fascinating transitions, or dispensations as we've been calling them, and what they reveal about God's character and humanity's journey. And now, as promised, we're stepping into that final chapter, that epic cosmic makeover, the destruction of the old earth, and the dawn of a new creation.
It's pretty wild to think about.
It is.
It's easy to focus on the destruction aspect of it.
Yeah.
But what really struck me about how this sermon describes this transition is the emphasis on new beginnings. It's not just an ending, it's this glorious fresh start, this picture of a new heaven and a new earth, this realm where God's presence dwells fully and permanently, free from all those limitations and brokenness of the previous eras.
It's like hitting that ultimate reset button, a divine upgrade for all of creation.
I like that.
But it does make me wonder, though. What about those who don't get to experience this new reality? What happens to those who haven't, accepted God's grace?
That's a question that a lot of people grapple with. And the sermon doesn't shy away from the difficult concept of judgment. It reiterates that those who choose to reject God's grace, they face eternal separation from him, a state described as eternity without God. And it's a sobering reminder that our choices do have consequences, even in the face of, ultimate love and forgiveness.
It's a tough concept to really wrap your head around, this idea of eternal destinies. It raises so many questions. I think, so now let's shift our focus back to the positive. The sermon offers this truly breathtaking picture of what awaits those who embrace God's grace. Can you tell us more about that? What does this new heaven and this new earth actually look like?
Well, the imagery that the sermon uses is incredibly evocative. It talks about a place where tears are wiped away, where there's no more pain or suffering, and where God's presence just fills all things. It's a vision of perfect harmony, beauty, and joy, a reality that has inspired and comforted believers for centuries.
It's almost beyond our capacity to imagine, right?
Yeah.
Like to picture a realm that's completely free from the brokenness of this world, where everything is made whole and new. What do you think? What aspects of our current reality would we even want to carry over into this new creation?
That's such a fascinating question. It makes you think about what truly matters, about the essence of who we are and what we really long for. Is it about, specific places or activities or relationships, or is it about something much deeper, a state of being, a connection with something greater than ourselves?
You're making me think maybe it's about shedding the limitations and pain of this world, while holding on to the love, the joy, the connections that really make life meaningful.
I think you're right. I think you're onto something. And perhaps that's part of the beauty of this vision. We can't fully grasp it with our finite minds, but it offers us a glimpse of something infinitely better, something worth striving for, something to hold on to, even amidst all the challenges of our current reality.
It's like this beacon of hope, right? Guiding us through the darkness and reminding us that this world, with all of its imperfections, this isn't the end of the story.
That's precisely it. And if we connect this back to those 7 dispensations that we've been exploring, it reveals an even more profound message, this story, this grand narrative that spans millennia. It's not just about God's judgment or even his grace. It's about his relentless pursuit of humanity, his unwavering desire to restore us to wholeness and to share his glory with us.
That's a powerful way to frame it. We're not just reading about history. We're witnessing this love story, this epic drama of redemption unfolding across time. Yeah. And it culminates in this vision of hope for all who choose to participate.
And that's the truly amazing part. We're not just passive observers in this story. We're active participants. The choices that we make, the way we live our lives, it all contributes to this tapestry of history, and it shapes the future of creation.
That's both empowering and a bit daunting, isn't it? To think that our actions, however small they may seem, can ripple through time and impact the grand scheme of things.
It is. It's a weighty responsibility,
Yep.
but also a profound privilege to know that we have a role to play in this cosmic story, that our lives matter in the eyes of the Creator. That's truly humbling and inspiring.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, what is the one thought that you would like to leave our listeners pondering?
If these 7 dispensations, with their recurring cycles of human failure and divine grace, ultimately point toward a God who constantly adapts and seeks to redeem, What does that say about the nature of his love? And how might that knowledge transform the way we live our lives, the choices that we make, and the impact we have on the world around us?
Those are profound questions, absolutely worth wrestling with. And we encourage you, the listener, to continue exploring these concepts, to delve deeper into the scriptures, and to seek your own understanding of this grand and awe-inspiring narrative. Thanks for joining us on this journey through biblical history. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.